Well, in the long road from coal to clean energy, South Africa's greatest challenge certainly isn't a lack of ideas or even political will. It's the ability to get money to move where it matters most. Billions have been pledged under the Just Energy Transition, but turning those promises into funded, shovel-ready projects, especially for township entrepreneurs and community groups and the coal belt towns of Mpumalanga, is really where the acid test lies. Today on the Monocle Banking Podcast, we go inside the presidency's JET funding platform, which is a matchmaking engine for South Africa's green future. In under a year, it's built a pipeline of 21 projects. It's mobilized 70 million rand and started connecting local innovators with global funders. I'm joined now by Nunu Ngoasheng, who leads this work inside the JET Project Management Unit, the PMU, which is the quiet nerve center of South Africa's transition. Nunu, welcome to the show. Hope you're well.
I'm great. Thank you, Michael, for having me, and hi to the listeners.
Let's just start with the big picture and help our listeners understand where the funding platform sits in the broader Just Energy Transition architecture and what problem you're really trying to solve when you built it.
Sure, absolutely. So the Just Energy Transition Project Management Unit sits within the presidency. It sits in the Project Management Office, which sits in the private office of the president. There's a lot of sitting. And essentially what we are trying to do, as you mentioned, is matchmaking grant projects to grant funders. And really the funding platform was originated out of the need to support projects on the ground that are affected by the energy transition, and particularly those in communities around the coal belt. So in 2021, at COP26 in Glasgow, a group of countries, the UK, formerly the US, Germany, France, and the EU as a group, pledged $8.5 billion to support South Africa to transition its economy. This was as a result of our more ambitious NDC, which is our nationally determined contribution, which is what every country submits to the UN every year in terms of how we are going to limit our carbon emissions in line with the Paris Agreement of keeping global warming at 2 degrees. So as part of this $8.5 billion pledge, most of this pledge is in highly concessional loans. A component of this was also grants, about $700 million. And as you know, South Africa has many socioeconomic challenges. There's a lot of inequality that we are trying to address. And because of this huge gap in the grant funding space when it comes to the energy transition, the funding platform was then originated as a way to bridge that funding gap with grant funding, because obviously grant funding is essentially quote unquote free money. And so, that money should then be earmarked to those who are most at need. And so what we are trying to do in the JET funding platform is to mobilize a pipeline of projects for grant funders, because they were also wondering about where is this credible pipeline of projects. And I can tell you that there are hundreds of projects and innovations out there. South Africans hugely innovative and creative when it comes to addressing problems at a local level, but also at a regional and national level. And so what we've seen in the last year that we've run the funding platform is this vast array of opportunities for grant funders to get involved in. So whether that is a feeding scheme for primary school learners or an ECD center, or helping provide startup capital to SMMEs who are doing what you would call an electric cargo bike for the waste pickers and waste recyclers, to even some of our, most sort of recognizable initiatives around youth employment, skills and services, is sort of the array of projects that we've seen in the last year of running the funding platform.
Very interesting, and I think a great scene setter that, and also just some flavor as to why the presidency itself needed to step in to speed things along. We've obviously got DFIs that do take on a bit more of a kind of first risk capital provider role, but when it comes to herding all the cats, so to speak, and ensuring that we're aligned here, it's great to see how successful the presidency has been with other initiatives. And you look at Operation Vulindlela as well, But let's just diagnose the bottleneck here, because everyone talks about billions in climate finance, yet small community or SME projects often battle to access the project or to get a foot in the door. Why? What are you seeing as the big bottleneck that is preventing SMEs and communities from getting involved in these projects?
That is a fabulous question. I think it's also one that we are trying to address through the funding platform. I think, in the last year that we've run the funding platform, surprisingly, we had a large number of applications coming from SMEs. I think that's because entrepreneurs probably consistently trying to look for opportunities for funding, for support for their businesses. And so we had about 70% of our applications come from SMEs. And I think that there's a huge gap in terms of sort of the SME ecosystem, particularly for those SMEs that are not located in large metropolitan areas in terms of network access. So access to accelerators, access to funders, access to sort of SME ecosystem support services like business development support, technical assistance support, project preparation support. I think, there were quite a few gaps in the applications that we saw as well coming from in the funding platform. And, one of the key gaps was around governance, right? So if you're an SME or an entrepreneur, and for us, it's very important that we ensure the credibility of the projects that we would put in front of funders. And so if you're an SME, but for instance, your governance is not up to date. And so you might have an outdated SARS tax PIN, for example. So that was where some of the projects that applied to us fell short on the funding platform. And I think when it comes to the other applicants that we are trying to support on the funding platform, which is namely community-based organizations, NGOs, organized labor, I think for us, one of the gaps that we identified was, I think, because entrepreneurs are constantly looking for opportunities. I think for us, it was a communications gap. So, people didn't know about the funding platform. So, how can we get into community radio stations, for example? Can we get into community Facebook groups and WhatsApp groups and start disseminating the information about the funding platform so that people know that there's an intervention out there? But also, I think coming back to this point around project readiness, project preparation, technical assistance, there's also a need in the market to address a gap of people putting down concepts or ideas that could then be turned into projects, whereas we were looking for something based on the demand from the funders of projects that were already demonstrated. It's funding at the moment from a grant landscape perspective is quite constrained. So, grant funding is almost like gold at the moment. And so, grant funders are only wanting to put something into a project that already has been demonstrated. So how can you ensure that those who are most affected by the energy transition and in the coal belt in communities where coal power stations are being decommissioned or retired can then, ensure that they are front end some of the ideas and concepts that they have and start turning those into something that has been demonstrated so that funders have enough comfort that when they put money into community-based organization, that there are systems in place, that this has been demonstrated, and that they're ensuring that they will have some sort of, call it a return on their investment, but an impact return, right? Not necessarily a commercial return, but an impact return.
And whose responsibility is that to help kind of handhold, shall we call it, the SME? Because one looks at the renewable IPPs, certainly the successful ones that have integrated communities into their projects. You look in the Karoo, there's several examples around the IPP project developer often takes a very proactive role in that case. Who should be leading here? Because I think often the SME or the community might be a little bit confused as to where they should go. Where's their first port of call to ensure they can be bankable?
So at the funding platform, what we are trying to do is to crowd in intermediaries. And so we are looking for projects, I think, particularly for us, I will say what's important is scale. So what we're wanting to do is ensure that we can drive impact in the most resource efficient way as possible, which has a high impact and which has a potential to scale. And so for us, that means wanting to crowd in intermediaries who funders have enough comfort around the work that they do. They've got sort of a track record, they've got experience doing this, reputationally, they're sound, systems are in place, who are already plugged into different ecosystems. So SME ecosystems or support networks around NGOs and community-based organizations or labor support organizations who can then tap into on-the-ground networks and ensure that projects are then sort of grant ready. And so there's a number of projects that are listed on our project register, which particularly look at supporting those different networks. And so you have one that's focused around green economy and green SMEs. We have one that's looking at community-based organizations and supporting them with small grants, ensuring that they are upskilled and knowledgeable about the energy transition, ensuring that from an environmental justice point of view, that is coming through quite strongly as well. And so that is, where we are trying to drive some of our resourcing and focus is to crowding in these intermediary groups who already are very tapped into, the various, sector networks and systems on the ground, so that not only do they know about the funding platform, but they can also be supported through the intermediary.
So far, 21 projects, 70 million Rand mobilized. It's not nothing. It's also not the 1.5 trillion Rand that the full transition requires. What kinds of projects make up that pipeline?
Yeah, as I mentioned, Michael, it's a vast array. And so, even in the 70% that has been mobilized, so we've matched 4 projects in the last year. And so one is a labor center, which is a research center on how labor can engage from a research perspective around the JET. One is the Social Employment Fund, which is an initiative supported by Treasury, really working in Komati, actually, which is probably one of the first examples of call it a town that's been affected by the transition, ensuring that they can be able to access part-time employment with a view that, the people who go through that program will either be inspired or, to become entrepreneurs, or they'll gain some skills and turn that into a future business or find employment elsewhere. And then another one is around looking at demand-led skilling opportunities. And then the other project is also particularly located on the ground, looking at how, and this is, I think, one of the key projects that looks at how and supports communities and in turning their ideas into actual businesses. So, something that might just be in someone's head or a passing thought, okay, let's, you think you want to do a waste management business. Okay, what does that look like for your community? And so they're trying to also create new types of business models as well. So looking at community ownership models. So how can the community benefit through sort of like revenue share type of model, as well shared governance models around that business. And so you've got, all those types of projects listed on our register, but you also have projects that are really focusing around youth employment. So how can you support placement opportunities for youth in the green economy? As I mentioned, we do have a feeding scheme one. We do have an early childhood development center as well. And then we've got a few projects that will be coming online that are also focusing around training youth to get involved in sort of the installation, repair, and maintenance sector from a solar installation point of view. And so there's quite a vast array of projects.
Right.
And then we've got a couple of SMMEs as well, who are startups, right? So they have a commercial, venture, but because of the nature, and I think this is also a gap in the market from a, commercial funding point of view, there's very little capital that's willing to take a risk on an SME that's or a startup that they haven't really got much to demonstrate. Yes, they've got a prototype, and yes, they've gotten some agreements with different industry bodies, but then they have not got the startup capital themselves, because they're also just a regular Joe or Jane who's come up with this great idea. And so they need grant funding to really, start picking up and piloting. So there's quite a few pilot initiatives from an SME perspective on our grant register, particularly around, there's a social enterprise that's doing biogas digesters, which is, sort of a franchise model.
Yeah.
There's a few EV projects there as well.
Yeah, but I think it just demonstrates the vast array, because often when we think jet funding, we think, it's got to be in renewable energy, but, early childhood development, community-based projects, I can think here of the circular economy and the need to help and assist formalize waste pickers in the waste stream
Absolutely.
as being those that would come into your bucket and your filter. And you built what looks like a very disciplined, almost investment banking style funnel from application to monitoring. Maybe you could just walk us through that kind of 7-step process, and who actually sits on the review committee, and how do you guard against the politics of selection?
Sure, that's a great question. And we held a very open process initially. And so we received, as I mentioned, 240 applications. And then through that, we had, I think, quite a normal drop off in terms of other types of, call it accelerators or funding opportunities. So people would apply to the funding platform, and then they would go through, call it a very quick assessment. Following that, they would go through a more in-depth assessment and a KYC, where we look at, we'd apply our assessment criteria. So we'd look at, scoring their impact and sustainability. We'd look at, some things like transition enabling outcomes. So, does this allow for job creation? Does it enable for people to access resources? We'd also look at, does this project empower communities? Is there community engagement for a project that is specifically for the benefit of the community? And then we also look, obviously for some projects, if they were energy related, then do they have emissions reductions targets? Is there sort of an energy efficiency point? And then also around, circular economy and waste reduction. And then a few projects then unfortunately did fall off because of this governance point that I had mentioned. Some obviously were not aligned, and they were not eligible because they just really didn't meet that criteria in terms of our scoring. And then the projects that were successful, who were then allowed to go through, sort of call it a second round. We'd have a face-to-face or virtual face-to-face with those organizations. We really give us an opportunity to sort of kick the tires, ask some more probing questions, get to have a look and feel for the project, call it owners themselves. And then they would take those projects actually all through this review committee, as you mentioned. And so that was an internal review committee, which was included myself as a funding platform team member, the other team members on our funding platform, our former technical assistants, partners, and then our senior leadership here at the JPMU. And so, the senior leadership were not really in the day-to-day operations of the project. And so, for them, there was a degree of independence in terms of, okay, we've seen this project, we like this about them. We'd give them sort of like a 3-page summary. This is what they scored. These are some of the questions that they have. And then so they would allow us and then, say, okay, this sounds like a good project, but, you can go back to them and ask them a few more questions, but we think that this project should be listed. And then, we had a large group of projects, unfortunately, that did not make it onto our register, but we saw as very high impact, which we do believe can benefit from, project preparation assistance. So that is something that we will be onboarding in the next couple of months. We've gotten some funding to do some project preparation. And so we do see different levels of project preparation. So one, the very light sort of governance project preparation, and then some of the more in-depth project preparation we see as around this grant readiness. So this is more supporting people around their systems, helping them to become a little bit more formalized, helping them to articulate sort of the plan of their project. And also some of the project we see that they need, just a little bit more hand-holding in terms of understanding, potentially not necessarily the financial modeling, but how can they also become a little bit more financially independent. Yes, because of the grant funding landscape at the moment, we understand that, not every grant funder is going to be willing to fund a project into perpetuity. So how can we help projects to start thinking about how can they also become a little bit more financially resilient in an era of, very constrained grant funding.
Yeah, as we know, given what's going on with the US as well, what are you actually seeing on the ground there? Because and I wanted to come to the pooled fund, which is really the next evolution of the platform you're targeting. I see an initial 100 million rand in catalytic capital. You've mentioned partners like the Ford Foundation. So, what are you seeing from these foundations, given the real politic of what's going on in the US at the moment, and frankly, the US doing a 180 on its climate leadership role in the world?
Yes, absolutely. I think, much of the, call it, pullback that we're seeing in the grant landscape, but I think also in the impact landscape more broadly, is as a result of the US pullout from development aid funding. And so what you've seen is many of the other sovereigns sort of following a similar suit in reducing their overseas development assistance, their ODA funding, which means that a lot of the grant funding that would have gone to certain projects or initiatives has been significantly reduced or is really on a very quick timeline in terms of, yeah, the money coming to an end. And so it has put an enormous pressure on the philanthropy sector, right? So
Yeah.
on the large foundations, not only, the international philanthropy sector, so the Ford Foundation, but also on the South African foundations as well, is that they have had to sort of plug the gap when it comes to this USAID pullouts. And so you have grant funders who are really struggling between, you know, the choices that they have to make because the USAID was funding such a large portion of South Africa's sort of first line responses in healthcare when it comes to, let's say, the HIV/AIDS response, for example, like the PEPFAR initiative, and in many sort of provincial departments, a lot of provincial budgets from a healthcare perspective were also supported by this USAID funding. And so when you're having to, make this decision between, a feeding scheme for creche and, HIV/AIDS prevention,
Wow.
South African foundations are really in a tough spot. And so you find them having to, I think, really sort of nitpick in terms of the impact that a project has to make. And so this is why I keep coming back to this point around we want initiatives that are, very high impact, but that are demonstrated, is because funders are becoming, a lot more, let me call it, discerning, for lack of a better word, when it comes to where to put their grant funding. But it's not just at the grant level, right? I was reading an article last week which says that even impact investing is down by 30%. And you've seen impact investors, and a few that we've also spoken to, and many of the foundations that we've spoken to, who have said that this year, for most of them, they have spent in strategy sessions. So how are they going to go forward given this changing landscape from a ODA and grant funding perspective? And so that is some of the challenges that we're finding. But one of the ideas in which we are working on at the moment in the funding platform is this idea around a pooled fund. And so how can we crowd in a variety of funders around, sort of an independent mechanism, which can also ensure that grant funders can be a little bit more unrestricted with the funding, because as you can imagine, each organization has a particular, call it, interest in terms of where they'd like to put their money. They have, certain restrictions and limitations in where they can put their money, into what type of organization they can put their money into. And so what we're finding, we have some of these SMMEs on our funding platform project register, but foundations are unable to put in any grant funding for them because they cannot fund PTY limiters, for example. And so, one of the ways in which we are trying to ensure that we can get more money more efficiently to projects is through a pooled fund mechanism where we're inviting, a variety of grant funders. And I think it also allows us to be potentially a little bit more blended as well in the types of funding that we may disperse to projects. So that would be impact investors, South African philanthropies, international philanthropies, and put it into a vehicle that would satisfy a number of different donors. So they could get their Section 18A certificates. They could, put in, yeah, they can sort of tick some of the boxes in terms of the SDGs that they're wanting to, report on and that they are supporting and targeting. So that is where we are trying to go. And so we're trying to, yeah, at least at this point, find the most suitable institution as well, because we at the PMU, we don't want to sort of, I mean, we're already working on the funding platform. So we'd like a degree of sort of an arm's length bullet relationship. So, yes, we would, input on the projects, but, ultimately we want this to be a donor-led initiative from a decision-making point of view.
Right.
We want to sort of remove ourselves from that and ensure that the donors are saying, okay, yes, we can disperse 2 million to this organization, 5 million to this organization, because we really see that grant funding can be quite catalytic. And if you can do, some of these smaller ticket sizes, if I can call it that, that also I think reduces some of the friction costs for some of the donors who typically, will do a 20 million disbursement, for example. But if you want to, support community-based organizations and they may just need, 5,000 Rand each, there's a mechanism for that to take place.
And clearly, you're playing that role also as a bridge, not just between the philanthropies and the SMEs, but also between our banks and institutional investors as well. So, how is the private sector responding? Are investors stepping up to match your ambition here? Are they still taking a wait and see approach and say, well, we might invest in a Series B or C round once this SME has proven themselves? And what role do you see for blended finance in the next phase?
Yeah, that's a great question. Interestingly, there is quite some interest from the private sector. Obviously, we've been engaging with the private sector more from a sort of CSI foundations point of view. But because there are these blended opportunities on the funding platform, and there's opportunities around sort of green economy interventions, I mentioned that we have these SMEs and intermediaries that are on our project register. And so, there's an opportunity for them to play a role, not just on a grant perspective, because I think in that sense, like grant funding could, and it should be unlocking the commercial opportunities. So, we've seen with some of the projects that are listed on our register, particularly the ones that are working around the EV space, is that they have reported that, the private sector is very interested in what they're doing. They've gotten sort of in-kind, call it, promise that they will, if they can raise X amount of grant funding, that X amount of commercial funding is available, and whether that be sort of like a debt or equity type of instrument. So there is some interest, I would say, but I think, it's this gap that I'm mentioning around the sort of startup with the grants that needs to unlock the commercial capital. So there are projects, if you look on our register, that have this blended request where they're looking for two types of instruments. And so we have seen one of the local DFIs be quite active in supporting some of our SMEs. They have sort of a cap of a 5 million grant, but they really, focus around sort of helping, industrialize and support the economy. And so that's been one of the sort of the clear supporters of the work that we're doing. And I think, we were still very early. We're about a year old. I know we need to do a lot more engagement when it comes to, the impact investors, but there's also, some interest as well in how impact investors can play a role in this pooled fund. It has been certainly a challenging year, particularly as a result of sort of all the geopolitical changes. But yeah, the interest is going. I think, demonstration is always going to sort of unlock more opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't think of a more difficult year in which to get a project like this off the ground. And here you are after year one, still standing, capital mobilized, projects funded, and a pipeline. For anyone listening, Nunu, a funder or a social enterprise or even local municipality, how can they engage with the platform right now? And what does success look like by the end of year two for you?
Well, for us, if you would like to engage with us as a funder, and we can send this to you, Michael, that we have a stakeholder registry which people can upload your contact information and we will be in contact with you. And then if you are a project who is looking to be funded through one of our funders, we will be opening a new window towards the end of the year. We're in the process of upgrading our online platform and our system. As I mentioned, we took a very open, wide cast net in the first year. And so going forward, we're going to streamline our process. We're going to have a lot more of a focused approach to our funding application windows. And so the next one will be around jobs and livelihoods. So we're looking for projects that have a demonstrated track record, that are looking for a sort of grant project request or ticket request of between 1 million and 20 million rand. And it is about 20 million rand, mostly from a demand perspective of where we find that donors are most comfortable from a funding perspective. So projects are very welcome to keep an eye out on our website for when that window will open. We'll also be hosting a few webinars in the coming weeks that provide a little bit more guidelines and assistance to projects and how to structure their applications, what kinds of applications are successful, how we will be sort of evaluating and scoring them going forward. So I would just say to the listeners to stay tuned, and to the funders, please join us. We are looking for funding partners to support us. We're looking for ecosystem operators and enablers to support us, particularly when it comes to project preparation and technical assistance. And if there's any intermediaries there who are already working on this work and looking to scale their impact, we also invite them to apply to the next coming windows so that we can hopefully put them on our project register and see those initiatives supported.
Yep, as the old saying goes, it takes a village. And I think in order to transition and to get the scale and the ambition right, it's going to take everyone in that village to build the ecosystem and to come together and bring their particular piece of the puzzle. And, the just energy transition is more than just an engineering project, as we've heard. It's a social contract. And I think if South Africa can prove that climate finance can reach the coal miners' town, the woman-owned startup, the local co-op, then perhaps we'll have found the true meaning of just in the transition. My thanks to Nunu Ngoasheng from the Presidency's JET PMU funding platform for sharing how this quiet experiment in catalytic funding is already changing the rules of engagement. I'm Michael Avery, and this has been the Monocle Banking Podcast. Until next time, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share in your networks.